Hartford Baptist Church, and welcome to a brand new study. We're going to do the Epistle of James, letter James. And this, of course, this is episode 1, and we're just going to be doing pretty much just one verse. This is our introduction, so we're going to spend the entire episode on the first verse, just talking a little bit who this James guy is, and a few other things. Whenever we started the way back when we were doing the study through the letter of Galatians, I mentioned that it was probably, in my opinion, the second oldest book in the New Testament. This one would be the oldest. It's up there with Galatians and Thessalonians. This one is, I think, written just a little bit before that. This could be really dated anywhere from between 44 A.D. It has to be before 62 A.D. because that's when James is dead. But it was probably very shortly after 44 A.D., if not within that same year. And we'll talk about the reasons for that dating here in a minute. But one I want to start with, if we look in verse 1, we have James, a servant of God. We'll talk about who is James, the servant of God. There's a multiple, James, basically there's two, I'll call it within Christianity, two major theories on which James this is. Some will say, let me go to, where do I want to go to? Let's go Matthew 10. We'll say the first option of James is whenever we look at the Matthew 10, we see the calling of the apostles. And down towards the end, right in between Thaddeus and Matthew, the tax collector, we have James, the son of Alphaeus. And this is who our Catholic friends will say this is who this James is. And that this James is the cousin of Jesus. And the reason that they say that is because, well, they have to say it's the cousin of, is because of Matthew 13:55. Of course, if you look at, we'll start in, verse 55 here. And this is what, of course, Jesus is in Nazareth. He's back in his hometown. This is what the townspeople are saying. Is this about Jesus? Is this not his mother called Mary? Are these not his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas? Are these not his sisters with us? The ESV and even why am I not on the net? Let me get my translation back up here. We'll get the net in that middle column, so we got a second one to look at. Sorry about that. Thought I already had it up there. Totally prepared for this, you can tell. All right, there we go. Now we're back. All right, so, and even the net will say the brothers, because the reason the ESV and the net both say brothers is because the Greek says adelphoi, says brothers. But of course, the Catholic Church teaches, and they didn't always teach this, this developed later over time, several centuries later, that Mary was perpetually a virgin. After the birth of Jesus, her and Joseph never had sex, never had any other kids, that she was a virgin till the day she died. Perpetual virginity. And if this is the son, as Matthew 55 seems to imply that these are the kids of children of Mary, Jesus' brothers and Joseph and Simon and Judas and sisters, right after they mentioned Mother Mary, the natural reading is that these are her children. So the Catholic Church is basically changing brothers to, these are her niece and nephews. These are Alphaeus' kids, despite Alphaeus being mentioned nowhere in this passage. But they have to do that to kind of prop up their doctrine of that perpetual virginity, which is not found in the Bible. They can't allow this. They can't allow brothers to mean brothers, and can't allow sisters to mean sisters. The other major view of who this author James is that this is the half-brother of Jesus. That the James that wrote this epistle is the James we see right here in Matthew 13:55. And in fact, not only do they believe that, the vast majority of Protestants believe that this James is written by half-brother James, but the book of Jude is written by half-brother Jude, or Judas as it reads here in Matthew. That this is the one who wrote that very short, quick read epistle of Jude. So here we have those two authors. Another interesting thing that we see about James, a half brother of Jesus, is, let's check out. No, don't want to go there yet. Yep, went to the wrong chapter. All right. So the Jerusalem Council. Of course, this was that we referenced this when we were in that Galatians Bible study. Paul confronts Peter. End result is the Council of Jerusalem. Can believers eat bacon, essentially? And of course, no, do they have to be circumcised? It really wasn't about bacon, but yet it was about bacon. And of course, when we go down in this, we keep going down and down. They're having this little court say it's a council. It's basically a ecclesiastical hearing. We got to find the proper church doctrine. Know how we're going to practice the faith. And in verse 13, we start seeing James replied. So James starts talking. And James is the one who then, verse 19 says, therefore my judgment is... James is the one who gave the judgment. James was the pastor, the chief among... I know we got Peter, who's also an apostle, and Peter's high ranking, no doubt. Paul calls him a pillar of the church. John was a pillar of the church in Jerusalem. But it seems that James was the chief among equals here. James had that kind of final say. James would be that guy we may call pastor or senior pastor of the church of Jerusalem. And keeping that in mind is going to help us make sense of why the letter of James was written. James as a pastor, which let me get back to our Epistle of James now. James as the pastor is writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. So who the 12 tribes that this pastor James is writing to? This could refer to the dispersion back in Babylon, conquered Israel. They went to Judea, and whenever they did it, they dispersed the people. They basically kicked them out of their homeland, brought them back to Babylon. And of course, they went other directions as well as they fled, but they're basically pushed out of their homeland, went to other cities. We also see another dispersion, a more recent one. And I think this may be the one that James is actually referring to. And this is in Acts chapter 11, verse 19. We see that, starting in verse 19, now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, Antioch, speaking the word to no one except the Jews. But then there were some of them, the men of Cyprus and Crete, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists, spoke to the Gentiles, they spoke to the Greeks. They were sharing the gospel with non-Jews. But what we had, we'll call it the dispersion, the scattering that occurred at the time of Stephen. Stephen was stoned. Stephen was stoned for being a Jewish Christian. Stephen was stoned for being a Christian. And at that time, people fled. The other believers basically were running away because they felt they'd be next. And that's when we see Saul, also known as Paul, starts to pursue them, to arrest them so they could be perhaps later put to death. So they are running for their lives. And one of the consequences of them running for their lives is they began to share the gospel with those Hellenists, these Greeks, non-Jewish people. They were preaching the Lord of Jesus to them. So here in that dispersion actually led to evangelism. It led to missions. Not on purpose, but that's not on purpose of man, but God had intended that as well, I believe. That this persecution, this scattering that we see after Stephen led to actual church growth. God used something that the Jewish people intended for evil. God intended that for good and to grow his church. Of course, it does say the 12 tribes. That implies Jewish people, right? Well, as what we've seen in Acts chapter 11, other than that one city, up until that point in Acts chapter 11, the gospel was only being preached to other Jewish people in those cities that they were running to, those nations they were running to. They were only basically sharing Jesus with other Jews. So at this point, especially if we're going to date this to 44 AD, right after Stephen's death, James is writing to Jews. He's writing to Jewish Christians. There's not really such thing as a Gentile Christian yet. There's a few, but predominantly at this point when James writes this, it's Jewish Christians. They are of the blood of the 12 tribes. But so in a sense, you could say this is to the church he's writing. It just happens that the church is mostly Jewish at this point, or this early stage of the church. And see what else we'll talk about. Oh, let's talk about we might as well mention how James dies. Dating of the book. I mentioned have to happen between 44 AD, which I'm dating based upon Stephen's death, and then the 62 AD, which was James's death. James, the half-brother of Jesus. He, which I believe I mentioned this in the study in Galatians, he died the quite interesting death. The Jewish leaders, through him, of course, James is preaching Jesus Christ crucified, Jesus Christ died for your sins, through Jesus Christ is salvation, and he's preaching Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And of course, one of those famous Jesus stories is the temptations of Satan. When Jesus was tempted by Satan, you remember that story where Satan has Jesus on the pinnacle saying, throw yourself down, the angels will catch you, prove you are who you say you are. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't do it. Well, that same pinnacle, if it was indeed the basically the part of the wall that looked down over the valley, church tradition that's handed down through Eusebius and Josephus and a few others is that James was thrown by the priests from that temple, from the temple at that pinnacle down into the valley. That was his execution. Kind of like, hey, you're telling the people that your brother was tempted by Satan here, and Satan told him to jump off. Well, we're just going to throw you off. James hits the ground. James is still alive. They then go down and they begin to stone James. James doesn't die. They end up killing him with a club. So very painful death, mocking, not only did they kill him, but they also mocked the temptation of Jesus as they did such. So that's why, if James the half-brother did write this, it has to be before 62 AD because that's when James met his end. This is, and then really, I would say it has to be before 49 AD because whenever we looked at the Council of Jerusalem earlier, that's when that most likely happened, just by dating the writing of Galatians and everything else going on in the world. And the fact that the Council of Jerusalem was mentioned in the book of Acts by Luke, and, in that whole, I'll say the council itself, but the issue of circumcision and food were big deals to Christians at this time. And so it would have kind of made sense for James to kind of mention that. Now, if this was after 49 AD, because that was a hot topic button. Can we eat these unclean foods? What used to be called unclean. Can we eat bacon? Do I have to circumcise my sons? These were things they were still trying to figure out. So this would have been a great opportunity for James to clarify that to people. But here's why also that if this is James, which I do believe it is, James the half-brother of Jesus, who is the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, this also makes sense why he would write this letter to those being dispersed. His church fled him. When Stephen was stoned, the church ran away. They're running for their lives. James did not leave. So the pastor's flock scattered. And throughout this letter, what this looks like is James writing to his former congregants. They've now left and they've started other churches, which is James may not have been initially happy with, but God certainly was, because the Christian faith began to grow rapidly. The story of Jesus began to spread at an incredible rate. It's kind of like blowing on a fire. You just fan the flames and the fire grows quicker. That was what was happening here with Christianity. That persecution that started by the priests and Saul just made Christianity grow quicker. But James is writing to his old congregants. The sheep have scattered, and he's writing a letter out to them, and it's going all directions. And he's going to try to encourage his former flock, in their mission work, in their faith, how to live accordingly in a hostile world. They're living among the pagans now. Jerusalem at the time, until they got pushed out, was a pretty safe place for them. The Roman government was letting them practice their faith how they seemed fit. And of course, if you read the book of Acts and things we've mentioned from Thessalonians and especially Galatians, the Greeks were not, well, I'm saying that even the Jews in this area were not near as friendly to these Christians as it was in Jerusalem up until this point. So life was rough. James is comforting them. And we've actually went pretty long here, so I'm going to wrap this up. And we will start next episode. We'll hit chapter 2 and start looking at what James is telling his old church members. Until then,